Committee for Academic Events in connection with our preparation for the Augsburg Centennial, I want to welcome you tonight to the continuation of our journey with man and his values around the world. We began yesterday morning in our own nation with two very fine presentations by members of our own faculty, Dr. Krislock and Dr. Stenchel. This morning we journeyed to Russia and heard a very splendid address by Mr. Leo Grulio, the editor of the current digest of the Soviet press. And then we have, in the last few hours, moved across to China. And we have with us tonight an eminent authority to speak to us on what is happening in that nation. And so, as I say, I welcome you to this very exciting trip, which will be concluded tomorrow afternoon when the symposium finds its summation and returns to the campus, with three of our own faculty members bringing this to a conclusion under the theme Man in a Three-Power World, Implications for the 70s and 80s, with Dr. Karl Krislock, Dr. Kinkin Jensen, and Dr. Norma Noonan participating. I suppose that the two non-Western countries with which this institution has had the most contact are China and Madagascar. This because of the long association of the college with a church body which had mission activity in those two countries. It is not surprising that you will find among the list of the distinguished alumni from this institution the names of three men who have spent the better part of their lives in China: Dr. Einar Andreasen, Dr. Ralph Mortensen, and Pastor Arthur Olson. Pastor Olson is in the audience tonight. Therefore, I think it is most appropriate that this important nation, which constitutes one of the three powers under consideration, should be the focus of our attention in our centennial series of symposia. And tonight we welcome Mr. O. Edmund Clubb to our campus. Mr. Clubb has a fascinating biography. Fascinating because it begins in Minnesota. He was born in Dakota County, and several of us have tried in vain to find the town in which he was born, which is listed as South Park. If you look in the map of Dakota County, you will not find South Park. My theory is that it became such a metropolis that it was divided into South St. Paul and St. Paul Park. Both of these towns you will find quite readily to the south and southwest of St. Paul. Let me describe Mr. Clubb's activity and background in terms of proper names and proper nouns. These, I think, will give you some idea of his history and accomplishments. You ask of his education, I would mention the University of Washington, the University of Minnesota, George Washington University, and California College in China, which intrigues me. I have no idea just exactly what that means. Maybe Mr. Clubb will tell us what happened to California College in China. You ask of his linguistic ability, and besides his very excellent command of his own native language, he speaks very competently Chinese, Russian, and French. I think, however, when you come to the area of his foreign service, that you have a most fascinating list of places where he has served. Listen to this list: Peking, Hankou, Nanking, Shanghai, Saigon, Hanoi, Chongqing, Lanzhou, Xinjiang, Vladivostok, Mukden, Harbin, Changchun, Washington, D.C. His academic activity has taken him to Columbia University, Brooklyn College, New York University, New School for Social Research, Florida State University, Cornell University, and Augsburg College. His literary works include reviews and articles by the score, his very eminent publication on China, 20th Century China, published in 1965, The International Position of Communist China, published in the same year, and in 1966, Sino-Soviet Military Relations. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome to the campus and to this platform Mr. Edmund Clubb. And after he has presented his lecture on China's great proletarian cultural revolution, I will ask you to send your questions forward to the platform, a slight change from what the program indicates, so that we may have this group for a while to hear him answer the queries which you direct to him. And then after that, I can promise you a cup of coffee. But will you fill out your questions on the cards which are before you or which you received with the program in order that he may then have your questions to answer? I'm happy to present Mr. Clubb to this audience. Mr. Clubb.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what happens to a person when his birthday and birthplace is taken away from him. I suppose that I'll be subjected to some sort of a trauma, but I haven't had a chance to think about it yet, so I still feel all right. Speaking about the subject before us, this is not only for China, Russia, Given modern trends, it's for all of us. You have the socialist aim, indeed, to leap from the realm of necessity into the realm of freedom. But you have forecasts such as set forth in the book 1984 and other suggestions of different ways that we shall go than toward freedom. You have still to achieve, even in the United States, the identification of individual interest with social interest. When I left New York City today, there was the garbage man strike, still in course. 6th, 7th day, and the garbage becoming higher and higher. Their social interest is rather on the slight side. They were more interested in capitalistic incentives, I think. For the past year and a half, there's been a very considerable concentration of attention on China. That is natural, given especially the great proletarian cultural revolution and the rampaging Red Guards. The Red Guards whose first activity was to attack the four olds, old things. Sometimes they happened to be just old men and women. They weren't very well directed. The meaning of this was not always very clear. However, it was clearly evidence of change in Chinese society, but the more specific meaning didn't quite come through. There was, at the end of January of last year, a TV show, perhaps some of you saw it. It was arranged by Theodore White, called The Roots of Madness. And he looked at the great proletarian cultural revolution. He looked at it, however, logically, because he looked at it from a beginning. He looked backward to see what the roots were in the past. And one, has to see the Chinese Revolution in perspective, as White tried to see it. You can say, well, that means we look back to 1949, doesn't it? No. It means you look back farther. 1912, perhaps, when the Republican forces overthrew the dynasty. No, farther than that. You have to go back at least to the Taiping Rebellion of the middle of the 19th century. This great rebellion, which lasted for 15 years and resulted in the deaths of, say, 20 million people, but failed. This Chinese revolution has been in course a long time. It's one of the three great social revolutions of the modern era, counting the French, the Russian, and now the Chinese. It is still unfinished. Don't judge it yet. Let's look, however, given our subject, and this is the broader subject, the role of man, at the historical role of man in Chinese philosophy. Chinese philosophy under the empire was Confucianism. But was Confucianism the sole philosophy of which the Chinese were capable? The answer is no. In the feudal period that preceded the empire, and the empire was established in the 3rd century BC, you had the era of the warring states, which lasted for 250 years. And during this particular period of turmoil and conflict, you had the so-called 100 schools of philosophical thought. Schools of altruism, the school of names, Taoism, Confucianism. One that I would mention, the school of legalism. The school of legalism developed the world's first complete theory of totalitarianism. It proposed the establishment of legal hierarchy, comprising the bureaucracy, which would govern by the use of rewards and punishments properly dealt out, agriculture, the peasantry, and the military aspect. This was to be a regimented, militarized state with full subordination of man to the will of the state. And be it remarked that it was the legalists who overcame the feudal era, who established the empire. It wasn't the Confucianists. The Confucianists came into power subsequently when their particular philosophy was changed to fit the needs of Chinese imperialism. This in the 1st century BC. However, some of the elements of legalism were retained, even though not advertised, by the Confucianists. There was an essential difference that I would point out. The Confucianists looked backwards. The legalists looked forwards with ruthless disregard for the past. But what was Confucianism? Originally, it was the exaltation of an ideal feudal system, the golden age of the past, like the Greeks had a golden age. It was concerned with the past. The emphasis was on hierarchy and ritual. It included ancestor worship, an indication of the value placed on man. The concept, the basic concept, was that the whole was a moral order of things. You had an orderly heaven above, an ordered society below, based upon universal and eternal principles. It was a moral universe. People who followed Confucius and followed the legalists, Mencius for one, taught that man was by nature good. Mencius said also that in the event there was misrule, there was the right of rebellion. The ruler lost his right to rule if he ruled badly. Another Confucian, Xunzi, a century later than Mencius, said that man was naturally bad, not good. The cure, however, was education. And education came to be stressed heavily in the Confucian system. It was in the 1st century BC, as I say, that you had the transformation of Confucianism into an instrumentality for the empire. Look at the Chinese man under the empire in this hierarchical order. You had at the top of the hierarchy the emperor, who was the son of heaven. By Confucianism, entitled to rule all men under heaven. And there were his ministers, the bureaucracy. Under the bureaucracy, this was a stratum by itself, you had 4 classes of the people. The scholars, and they came first. The peasants, the artisans, and the merchants. Now, there was a relative stability in these social hierarchical relationships. Confucianism, after all, became the state religion You were bound by religious ties. Important for this stability were the 5 relationships of Confucianism. The relation between prince and minister, father and son, man and wife, between brothers, and between friends. Now here you note that only one loyalty was to the state, the loyalty of the ministers to the prince. The prime loyalties of Chinese man were to the family and friends. In this particular Confucian order, you had a privileged position for the scholars, if you will. They were the people who, as Confucianists, who knew the classics, were able to rule under the emperor. And they actually filled the bureaucracy. It was early in the system that there were introduced examinations, civil service examinations, which Teddy Roosevelt eventually introduced in the United States, in order that there should be governing by merit. These scholars sometimes did not get official positions, and instead of being bureaucrats, they turned out to be poets or teachers. They could be artists. But once they passed the examinations, they never again went back to the land or to occupations that were menial. Then you had the peasants. The state rested upon the peasants. In theory, the peasant could, of course, become educated, rise up through the ranks, become a prime minister. It didn't happen very often, but it could happen. You had then orthodoxy in China, under the heavens, with man functioning in a communal order. And here you had this vital role played by education to bring out the essential humanism of the Confucian order, which placed high value on communal man. A moral order under a moral ruler. But of course, rulers sometimes aren't moral, even in China. You had the right of rebellion, which of course you always had to enforce with power. But it was done sufficiently in China so that in 2,000 years you had 25 different dynasties. 25 different times dynasties were overthrown, always by violence, down to 1912. 1912, you had, on the part of the Republicans, a legacy of frustrations which they carried over from the 19th century, when imperial China, which had thought that its emperor should rule all men, was subjected to the battering of the sea powers come from the west, and likewise of the land power, Russia. From 1912 to 1949, you had an interregnum of disorder. This was normal after the fall of a dynasty. It was part of the Han cycle, which marked the rise of dynasties to a peak of power and influence, and then decline, deterioration, corruption, and finally demise. Always followed by this disorder while people struggled for power. In the turmoil of this particular struggle for power, new revolutionary forces were born. One force descended from the Russian Revolution, and, be it said, from the Taiping Rebellion, and also from the disappointments experienced by China as a result of the findings of the people assembled at Versailles to sign the treaty. There was a strong compound of modern nationalism that was introduced into China in this period. This likewise is when you had the beginning of the Chinese Communist movement. And within 30 years after Versailles, exactly 30 years, as a matter of fact, the communists succeeded to power. This was the end of the Interregnum of Disorder, so far as we see. In 1949, the communists, too, had this same legacy from the past, identical with the legacy of the Republicans of 4 decades before, but compounded by the vicissitudes of time, because there had been further battering, internal and external, on China. So these new rulers experienced frustrations and bitterness, and they had the urge of all Republican Chinese, the urge to become strong, to have China resume the position of the Middle Kingdom in Asia. The question always being, how? One goal here was the reconstruction of Chinese society. Now, I have a thesis that I offer you, and that is that the Chinese communists are more Chinese than they are communist. Mao Zedong suggested that when, some time ago, before the quarrel with Moscow, he said, Russian history created the Russian system. Chinese history will create the Chinese system. Now I invite your attention to a basic difference between the Chinese communists and their antecedent Chinese republicans. The Chinese communist philosophy had evolved into a much more radical stage than that of the warlord republicans or the nationalists that finally overthrew the warlord republicans. Let's look at the thought of Mao Zedong, at some of its essential elements in brief. 1. Mao believes that the doctrines that he voiced are essentially determined by cosmic law, just as if it were Confucianism. He believes that he has the truth, even if that truth takes on changing aspects. The truth, he says, then, is Maoism. That's the truth for the present era. Mao likewise believes in a hierarchy, in bureaucracy, and in society. He believes that the whole of society should be structured. He sees himself as the leader. He acts pretty much as if he thought he were the Son of Heaven, and equally infallible with the Son of Heaven. He has likewise a theory, the theory of contradictions. It is the old Hegelian thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. He puts it in different terms. But he does believe that by the opposing of one antagonistic force to another, by the use of struggle, society is pushed forward. There is progress. He does not believe in harmony, which was the essence of Confucianism, particularly for communal relations. Society, he believes, by the use of the theory of contradictions, can be pushed forward not only gradually, but at a rapid pace, if you use the mass force of society, of humanity. He believes in uninterrupted revolution. This reminds one of the permanent revolution of Trotsky. Mao uses a different term. It is really strictly translated from the Chinese. Uninterrupted revolution, but it amounts to essentially the same thing. He believes that the revolution at home in China and abroad should be continuous until you get another thing that he has imagined. The creation of a world state, which he views as being possible only in the Maoist pattern. He believes that this can be undertaken and achieved by and all enemies be overcome through protracted warfare. In the end, you would have what the Chinese have thought of from the beginning, Datung, universalism, universal rule. This is a concept that goes back in Chinese philosophy to before the Christian era. Mao isn't original in that regard. A major task, isn't it? The question is the one I raised before. How? And Mao's answer is by the creation of a new Chinese man. Now you've had an exposition of the Soviet man. We might make here a slight comparison. I don't know what Mr. Grulio said, but it does appear that there have been new outlooks offered for the Soviet man. At the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, held in 1961, there was opened up the vista, a utopian vista perhaps, but a vista, of a future communism which, be it remarked, could fit Russian and Eastern European conditions, but would be hardly likely to fit Chinese. In any event, at that time, one of the philosophers of this new vision said, "Everything for man," which of course is an old communist cry. The suggestion would be that there would be an increase of material comforts. Shall we call them material incentives? They are going forward in the Soviet Union at the present time, likewise with the further development of communal responsibility, with more decentralization of controls, with more laying of responsibility on the people in the towns and the villages, back to the fields, factories, and workshops, which of course is reminiscent, isn't it, of the Kropotkin anarchism. There is, at the present time, and it is visible, some relaxation of the police controls over the human spirit, and an increase in the Soviet Union of what we would term liberalism. But look at Mao and the Chinese man. You had, under the new governmental hierarchy, again, 4 new classes of people. Mao, be it remarked, had relied upon the peasant for 2 decades of guerrilla warfare. He wasn't in a position to rely entirely upon them. He needed the intellectuals of the country for leadership, for technical skills, just for knowledge. But he wanted to use them in his way. And in May of 1942, before victory, speaking to the Forum on Literature and Art, which was held at Yan'an at that time, he undertook the beginning of the rectification of the intellectual. Rectification is a commonly used term in China today, so you should come around to it. There was the question of standpoint. He said, we adopt the standpoint of the proletariat and the people. He didn't say of the intellectual leaders of the past. He said, in the world of today, all culture or literature and art belong to some one definite class, some one definite party. That is, some one definite political line. Art for art's sake, art which transcends class or party, art which stands as a bystander to or independent of politics, does not in actual fact exist. He ruled it out of order like my birthplace. Proletarian art and literature, he went on, are one part of the entire revolutionary cause. And again, we not only do not recognize abstract and eternal political standards, but also do not recognize such standards for art. This was an expression, if you'll permit me to sum up, of his anti-liberal spirit. In 1949, on the verge of victory, Mao spoke on the people's democratic dictatorship. This was July the 1st of that year. It was the 28th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. He said, the experience of several decades tells us to carry out the people's democratic dictatorship. That is, the right of reactionaries to voice their opinions must be abolished, and only the people are allowed to have the right of voicing their opinions. He asked the question, who are the people? Now you will know who the 4 classes are. He said, at the present stage of China, they are the working class, the peasant class, the petty bourgeoisie, and national bourgeoisie. No scholars. He went on, under the leadership of the working class and the Communist Party, these classes unite together to form their own state and elect their own government, so as to carry out a dictatorship over the lackeys of imperialism, the landlord class, the bureaucratic capitalist class, and the Kuomintang reactionaries and their henchmen representing these classes, to suppress them, allowing them only to behave properly and not to talk and act wildly. Now here you note, some of these classes were already non-people to be eliminated. And there were other classes, the national and the petty bourgeoisie, booked for early elimination. The ultimate design of Mao Zedong is a classless society where all people are essentially the same. When I was in Peking in 1949, the communists entered the town. One of the first of the phenomena that we observed was their meetings. Meetings for criticism of each other and for self-criticism. Meetings which led to what they called 学习, study and practice. Study of Maoism and putting it into practice. The intellectual was being enlisted in the service of the revolution. But I remind you that he was to be remolded. And this remolding process, which was begun in 1942, was not ended yet. In 1951 and 1952, you had the so-called three antis and the four antis movements. The three anti movement was against bad elements within the bureaucracy, within the Chinese Communist Party. The five antis were against bad elements, people who cheated, people who stole state secrets, people who didn't pay their taxes in the bourgeoisie. And there was a certain amount of purging as a result of this, and presumably some rectification. In 1956, it was thought, apparently by Mao Zedong, that there had been enough rectification so that people were on the line. The 100 Flowers campaign was launched. It was announced that let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend. The 100 schools of thought remind you of the 100 schools of philosophical thought of the feudal era, doesn't it? When there was freedom of thought. Because different philosophers lived in different feudal states. Here, too, you had the invitation to be free in your thinking, and the scholars, the intellectuals, were invited to criticize the party. They kept their mouths closed. They were urged to criticize, and finally they did. It was presumably thought by Mao Zedong that they would give only helpful, constructive criticism. But in fact, they were exceedingly destructive when they got going and were prepared to condemn the party and its leadership. This was going too far, and Mao Zedong then launched a new purge. There was rectification in the party that in the year 1957. And this rectification movement was followed by an anti-rightist movement, continued for the rest of the year, against those among the intellectuals and the professionals who had spoken out their thought so boldly. Now you see, or you get an inkling of, the image of the Maoist man. He would be close to the soil and the factories. He would not have free-ranging thought. That's liberalism. He would be an orthodox Maoist. He would think as Mao thinks. He would be governed not by selfishness, incentives, higher wages. Revolutionary idealism and enthusiasm would be enough to cause him to serve the state. And he would be an all-round man. He might be farmer, or he might turn into a soldier. He wouldn't retreat into the library, however, and become a scholar. Mao fundamentally dislikes bureaucrats. They tend toward conservatism and power ambitions. Be it remarked that the Taipings were anti-bureaucratic too. One of the cries of that particular period was, "Daguan, strike down the bureaucrat." And Mao, in that respect, follows the Taipings. Of course, bureaucracy is a problem for every country. We know that. So Mao isn't entirely alone in that regard, in facing that problem. Mao likewise, however, does not like intellectuals. He suspects their virtues. They tend to be independent. They tend to disagree with him. And that is heterodoxy. Now, in 1957, when these campaigns were being carried on, China had reached a critical juncture in its domestic and foreign affairs. 1957 marked the development of a distinct scissors gap in China's economy. And China either had to have help from the outside or to pull back and to adjust itself to its resources. It was unable, I won't go into the story, to get help from the Soviet Union to the degree that it desired. And in 1958, China chose, under Mao's leadership, to attempt the great leap in industry and agriculture. By the harnessing of revolutionary enthusiasm, by the will and the strength of the masses, China was going to leap over an economic stage. There was disregard of the advice of the intellectuals and of the experts. The slogan at this particular time was politics in command, which meant that the enthusiast should govern, not the expert. You had another slogan, 3 red banners. One banner was socialist construction, or the general line of socialist construction. Another is the agricultural commune. The third is the Great Leap. Those are the 3 red banners invented that year. They were going to, they said, walk on 2 legs. Insofar as they had modern technology, they would use it. Insofar as they did not, they would use native technology. That's walking on 2 legs. And there was the theory put forward that the technician, the cadre, should be read and expert. He should be the new revolutionary expert. But the red came first. Now, there are certain Soviet antecedents for this thought. In the Soviet system, too, it was early believed that the technician should be both read and expert. Subsequently, they came around to the idea that the technician could be expert without going beneath his skin to see whether he was read all the way through. Here you had then this basic concept that the revolutionary urge and the Chinese mass are omnipotent and can achieve miracles. It was in 1958 that you had the introduction of the agricultural commune. Some 720,000 collective farms were reorganized to make first some 26,000 and then finally 24,000 great communes. You can imagine how many were in each commune, how many people. But this didn't make any difference to them because the mass was going to be regimented. And they separated men and women for different tasks. They mobilized people in martial rank, marched them to the fields, marched them to construct irrigation projects, marched them far away to build new highways and the rest. There was at this time, as you can readily infer, an attack upon the existing collective at the social level, the family. China now was going to have the bigger collective, the commune. And ownership thereafter would no longer be with the agricultural producers cooperative, which was a modest-sized collective farm, but it would be with the whole people. The whole people owned the whole land and should act effectively as a unit. Think of the problem of reorganization, of control, of distribution of energies, and all the rest, thus given to the read instead of the expert. Even if they had called upon the experts, there weren't by any manner of means enough to go around. And that this is true was shown that in 1959 and 1960, you had the results in economic disaster, maladjustment, dislocation of the economy. That this is true was attested by certain work papers that came into the hands of the State Department, which released them. They were translated, reporting that there had been grave unrest in the Chinese countryside, an unrest that had affected the militia, the army, the cadres, and the people. They undertook adjustments, but of course the problem was great. The question arose at this particular time, was the Communist Party leadership united behind Peking's policies regarding domestic programs, foreign affairs, military doctrine, world strategy? It looked as if at the time it was, but later there was evidence that there had occurred a strong prior debate in the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party regarding the advisability of the Great Leap. In 1959, in fact, Mao Zedong lost the chairmanship of the Chinese People's Republic, and it went to Liu Shaoqi, the man who occupies that post today. It wasn't a complete defeat for Mao Zedong, because he did not lose control of the Central Committee. He's still chairman of that body, of the Chinese Communist Party. He had enough strength so that in September, the then defense minister, who had opposed him with respect to military organization and the Great Leap, Peng Dehuai, went out. Lin Biao came in as defense minister and is there today. This was a Maoist victory. There was a disclosure in the course of the great Proletarian Cultural Revolution that Mao Zedong, in confrontation in the Central Committee of August 1959, at which these events occurred, threatened that if his proposals were rejected, he would retreat to the agrarian countryside, raise a new army, and wage civil war. Now you can draw two conclusions from these events. Mao had shown himself to be not a revolutionary materialist, a Marxist-Leninist, but a revolutionary idealist, a Maoist, a dreamer of great thoughts, who would be ready to undertake great ventures, even if wholly impracticable. He was a utopian socialist. Second, Mao Zedong had adopted a position of rigid dogmatism for which he was ready to wreck the existing hierarchy in order to prove himself right. Now in 1960, Mao Zedong undertook another war. I suggested that there had been this difference of opinion between Mao and the Soviet Union in 1957 with respect to the giving of aid to China. He didn't get what he wanted. In 1960, he brought his quarrel out into the open, anticipating, I believe, that he would be able to lever the Soviet Union into compliance with his wishes by making it public, making it a public display, not making the issues public. They argued about other things, Leninist problems, but don't bother about those words. The Soviets did not bow. In the summer of 1960, they withdrew their support entirely from China, pulled out their engineers and technicians, and they had supplied over 10,000 since 1950, reduced their aid instead of increasing it. The impact on the Chinese economy was great, and it was on top of the impact of the 1958 disaster. The result was that China now had to turn inward upon itself, using the doctrine of self-reliance, the old story of the sour grapes. If you can't rely upon somebody else, you rely upon yourself. China now had no one else upon whom to rely, and it therefore extolled the virtues of self-reliance and said, we'll build our own society. In early 1961, it was necessary to reintroduce a sense of realism. There was further emphasis now on the expert. He had to pull the economy together. The red, the person who was only enthusiastic but might be stupid, was now downgraded. You had, during this period, 1960 to 62, considerable concern then for the rehabilitation of industrial production, agricultural production. You had the expert preeminent, the red only sitting in the background. You had the transformation of the commune. Instead of 24,000, there are now about 74,000. The commune still exists on three levels, the top level being for administration. It has social services attached, education, hygiene, all the rest of it, engineering, so forth. Then you go down to the production brigade, and finally to the production team, which brings it back to the agricultural village, which is where the agricultural effort was in the beginning. But there was further transformation. Private plots, which had been taken away from the peasant during the attempted Great Leap, were returned to him. Free fairs were permitted so that he could sell some of his products there, after he had, of course, supplied the requirements of the state. These were incentives. Incentives were likewise introduced into industry. The worker wasn't required to work only for love of Mao Zedong or for love of the state. This all, however, resulted in the frustration of Mao Zedong, who reputedly also had been pushed somewhat into the background. He looked at the slowdown of industrialization, where his heart was with rapid pace. He looked at the growth of capitalism under what you might call China's NEP, China's new economic plan. The Soviets had a new economic plan, you know, at the beginning of the 1920s. This, for Mao, was Chinese revisionism. He didn't like revisionism. There was likewise frustration of the Chinese international purpose. From 1958 onwards, in fact, they had only frustrations abroad. They had undertaken a more radical approach to foreign affairs. They had frustrations in almost all fields. One saw an expression of Mao's will when, in September of 1962, they undertook socialist education, a new campaign for ideological rectification. It was to be among the codders in the agricultural countryside, to get them to work better for less. Mao Zedong was endeavoring to resume the class struggle. But of course, the codders and the intellectuals had been through this before. They had had the promise of 1950, and I heard it when I was in Peking, that with the effort of only 3 years or so, China would be in a much better economic condition than when imperialist influence dominated the country. It wasn't so. There had been a new promise in 1958 of a paradise in only a few years, instead of which they got this economic dislocation, which resulted in a decrease of grain production, in a decrease likewise of production of other consumption goods, less instead of more. And in the Great Leap, Mao had shown his fallibility, and all people knew it, even though they didn't say it. Now, there was this laborious economic recovery through the policy of self-reliance, but there was progress. The question arose in the minds of many people, was the break with the Soviet Union necessary or desirable? The answer had to be given by Mao Zedong, the great Jacobin, the man who believes in uninterrupted revolution. Once more, in 1962, he envisaged politics in command. He was going to indoctrinate the cadre and the workers in the countryside with revolutionary enthusiasm and the spirit of selflessness. Through mass mobilization, there would be performed again miracles of human endeavor. This without incentives, because China's material poverty, be it admitted, is profound. And Mao, if he were to stop to meet the needs of the people, would have to slow the progress of industrialization. He didn't want to do that. You see further progress a year later. In July of 1963, China rejected the last chance, perhaps, of reconciliation on a Maoist basis with Moscow. Representatives of the two parties, the Chinese and the Soviet, had met in Moscow to try to achieve that reconciliation. The Chinese delegation, armed with the thought and orders, of course, of Mao Zedong, placed their price high and made it public before they went. They wanted practically complete surrender of the Soviet side. The Soviets didn't surrender. And so Mao undertook his major war now against revisionism, Soviet revisionism, and what had been simply a non-antagonistic contradiction before, one that can be resolved by rational discussion between friends became an antagonistic contradiction between Mao and his enemies in Moscow, one that can be resolved only by the application of superior force. And in the New Year's issue of the People's Daily, January 1st, 1964, New Year's messages are always important in Chinese ideology. New guidelines were laid down. There was the exhortation, hold aloft the brilliant banner of socialist construction and further carry out the three revolutionary movements, the class struggle, production struggle, and scientific experiment. And then there was launched a month later a campaign to learn from the experience of the People's Liberation Army in political and ideological work. Now, I remind you that this People's Liberation Army was headed by the man selected by Mao Zedong to replace Peng Dehuai, namely Lin Biao, the lieutenant of Mao. Here you have a further undertaking on the part of Mao Zedong to strengthen the political and military power of the Chinese state through increased regimentation, a regimentation reminiscent of the regimentation proposed by the legalists of the 3rd century BC, where Taoism proposes the adjustment to nature, harmony with the universe. Maoism proposed war on nature, eternal struggle under heaven by the use of the regimented manpower of China. But you have this unyielding problem. How, in the circumstances, is China to become strong? How to dominate? Use the red line or the expert line? Further developments came. In July of 1964, you had the launching of the Cultural Revolution, not the great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, the Cultural Revolution, which was the forerunner of the next stage. This was for the rectification of cultural circles of China, of the intellectual, the academician, the student. And in early 1964, you had a step up of the campaign for emulation of the People's Liberation Army by governmental workers, educators, on the farm, in the fields, in the streets. You had the beginning of the turn toward the military arm instead of to party authority. The army was to be a party within the party. But this was diverted for a moment by the introduction of new factors into the Chinese political equation in 1965. You'll remember that it was then that we began the bombing of North Vietnam. It was then, too, that the Chinese were called upon to prepare for the third five-year plan, which had been announced as beginning in 1966. And so you had the concrete issues of national defense and economic construction. National defense against the American threat, believed to be, with a weak army, an economic advance with weak capital accumulation, weak technology, and a weak agriculture. You had in this year a secret and extraordinary meeting of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, where I believe Mao Zedong was faced by a majority of opinion opposed to him. The proposals of the professionals, or proposal of the professionals, was probably seek Soviet aid in both cases. Mao was a man who had gone too far to retreat in his campaign against revisionism, and he refused to retreat. And it was beginning in the fall of 1965 that you had the first dismissal of the opponents of Mao Zedong. Scholars, bureaucrats, intellectuals, the military man Luo Rei-Qing, chief of staff, a man who had come in with Lin Biao, people who were close to the Central Committee. And then in 1966 you had the great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, the closing of the schools, and then in August the massing of the Red Guards. Mao got his resolution through the Central Committee, but it was a resolution that gave less than he desired. It approved the great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, but the Central Committee majority retained their power. Mao then undertook to attack the majority. What had begun as a conflict between red and expert and had been brought forward in a conflict over national policy between reds and experts had been transformed into a struggle over power. The Maoist minority faction was against the CC majority. The error was that Mao had endeavored to attack too many. I won't go through the whole of the great proletarian cultural revolution. I will indicate, however, that there were essentially 4 stages in the open power struggle. First, you had, indeed, the Red Guards against the old influences. But the children, they were teenagers, were immature, inexperienced, undisciplined, unorganized, and they were defeated. That doesn't mean that you don't run into the name Red Guards. You do. The Red Guards didn't immediately go home, though they were told to go home in November. They liked to roam the country and to exercise their weight. But it was necessary in December to call the revolutionary rebels into action. They were the more mature people in the fields and the factories. They were overcome too, because the opposition had dug itself in deeply into the trenches, and they knew something about organization. They used economism against the rebels. They used capitalistic incentives, distributed some of the money and the funds and that sort of thing. Mao's revolutionary rebels were driven into retreat effectively by the revolutionary rebels of Liu Shaoqi. In January of 1967, Mao called on the People's Liberation Army, discovered that it was divided. Lin Biao didn't command a unified army. He commanded an army made up of partisans of Mao Zedong and of Liu Shaoqi and the organization men. And if you'd sent that army into action against one faction, it would split, and you would have civil war. Mao then began his retreat, projected the Triple Alliance, which is what you see them working on today, of the revolutionary masses, the revolutionary cadres, and the People's Liberation Army. This is the stage in which we are at the present time. It is a stage in which one can't see too deeply into the future or too clearly. You see the Reds against the experts, the visionaries against the pragmatists. The revolutionaries are Mao Zedong, Lin Biao, Mao's wife Jiang Qing, Mao's brain trust, Chen Boda, people like that, a handful of people. Mao Zedong is 74. Lin Biao has often been ailing. His position may be shaky. These men are mortal. The Red Guards and the revolutionary rebels, are they the makings of a parallel hierarchy to replace the Chinese Communist Party? Will you have militarization through the Triple Alliance? When you look at the opposition are the professionals, the organization men, experts, pragmatists, the Chinese revisionists. They include important elements in the People's Liberation Army. And then besides that, you have just the Communist Party apparatus. And finally, the peasants and the workers, who, if Mao doesn't like capitalist incentives, they like it. They want more food, they want more wages, they want more to wear, better houses in which to live. I'm inclined to make prediction. Mao is losing, and I think that the people who win in the end will be the organization men. Mao, if he surrenders enough and lives, will perhaps still be given a position, an honorary chairmanship of the Central Committee. There is such a post. It's never been filled. It's there waiting for Mao Zedong. If he resists too long, they may have to put him out of the way. But I believe that the organization men will win. In the event that they do not, in the event that Mao wins, you will have further disorder in China and a more dangerous China abroad. You can test my prediction by looking at the upcoming 9th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. It is now some 8 years overdue. It is forecast for this year. We're not sure that the forecast will come true. But when the party is held, the faction that has won will place its interpretation on the developments of the past and will lay down the program for the future. So we return to look at Mao and the Chinese man. Mao, in his power struggle, has violated his own revolutionary precepts of a day when he had a different mind. As a result, he has been destructive of the discipline of the democratic centralism, which is the essence of the Chinese Communist Party. He has damaged the prestige of the Chinese Communist Party and the authority of the government. He has depreciated the image of Mao Zedong himself. In these senses, Mao has betrayed the purpose he set for the new Chinese man. The result of his own romanticism, his revolutionary romanticism, is that in these circumstances there is a strong probability the Chinese man will depart from the pattern created by Mao Zedong. The Chinese man of the future could well be the patient peasant assiduously cultivating his own poor fields, the Chinese worker at a factory machine, Chinese teachers and intellectuals, all bent to the tremendous tasks of China's reconstruction, in response, probably, to material incentives. If that is true, there could be a peaceful China. That is, if there is a peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clubb. I don't know how you feel, but having stretched my mind all the way across Russia and now all the way across China, I feel a little outstretched. But I am sure that there are a number of questions that you would like to put to Mr. Clubb, and I'm going to ask the ushers to come down the aisles, and if you will quickly send these to the aisles, we will collect them. Perhaps we should give our guest just a moment to catch his breath before these questions are put to him, and I assure you that we will not keep on beyond our endurance here, but I think that you will want to put your queries to Mr. Clubb. Perhaps I could begin with a question so that we could get the discussion started. Would you say, Mr. Clubb, that even though the attitude of America and some of its allies might change with respect to Red China's entrance into the United Nations, that Red China would not accept that invitation? Do you feel that this is the attitude of the Chinese government today?
I believe that China would accept. I base that statement on the circumstance that in 1950 they appointed a delegation to come to take the seat of China in the United Nations. Of course, a lot has happened since then. You've had the Korean War. You've had a number of other things. China, upon occasion, has criticized the United Nations. It has even said there must be a completely new United Nations. But it didn't say, even on that occasion, that it would endeavor to rebuild the United Nations only from the outside. And you'll appreciate that China's entry into the United Nations would be a very considerable victory for the Chinese faction at Peking over the Chinese faction at Taipei. It would be a victory over the United States as well, which has supported for so long its nationalist ally in the United Nations. But there's a more practical reason. China at the present time is a country with great needs, economic and political. It can serve those needs only by following not the ideology of Mao Zedong, but by achieving better, more friendly and cooperative relations with sources of power, of material, of knowledge, That means that it should have better relations with other countries such as France, Britain, Canada, West Germany, as well as within the communist bloc. It can find in the United Nations a forum for achieving some of those better relations, as well as a forum for expressing some of its views and getting a better hearing. So I tend to believe that the Peking delegation would come. Let it be remarked that in any event, the authorities in Washington are sufficiently fearful of that possibility that they don't want to put the matter to a test.
Well, I think you have your work cut out for you. There are a number of questions here, and I'm not going to presume to be able to sort them out so that you can take them in whatever order you wish.
I suppose that as an old poker player, I should properly shuffle these. Otherwise, there may be some favoritism in the way that they were picked up. But I will also try to be relatively brief. I tend to make long answers, and I see there are quite a few questions. So suppose I take this one first. Would I comment on the fear prevalent in the United States toward China and the role this plays in China's development and ours related to the Vietnam crisis? Well, Mr. Rusk, speaking in October last year, related it very clearly to the Vietnam crisis. He pointed to China and said that in 1980, China would have 1 billion people and a nuclear establishment. He indicated by ready inference that this was one reason we were fighting in Vietnam. And in fact, we have said much earlier that the reason we are in Vietnam is to fight China and to contain Chinese communism. This, of course, is on the basis of the assumption that if we weren't there, the Chinese would outflow from their frontiers and overrun the periphery of Asia. We therefore have on the periphery of Asia our military bases manned by American fighting men, and the number at the present time, counting Navy and Air Force, and counting those in Vietnam, is probably upwards of 1 million men. And they have nuclear weapons as well as others. You can appreciate that if China were in the same position around the periphery of the United States, we might feel rather apprehensive respecting their intentions. They feel apprehensive regarding ours. They are hostile to our position. We feel that hostility, and our hostility goes back to the time when we were on the nationalist side in 1946 to 49. Hostility breeds hostility, just as friendship or friendliness breeds friendliness. Therefore, commenting upon this, I would say that our fears of China as an enemy overcome the possibilities that we might look upon China as a possible friend. It is necessary, consequently, to examine our fears, see how real they are, be reasonable about it, instead of assuming, just because we have a hypothesis, that China is inevitably almost to be opposed to us in the distant or the near future. I believe, consequently, that the role these fears play in China's development and ours, because we are now in confrontation and war is possible, is great, not only for the two nations, but for humanity itself. I will pick these questions at random in so far as I can. I'll try not to repeat, so if I go from one to another without answering, it may be because I don't know the answer. I don't pretend to know all the answers, but it might be also because I've answered it before. Would China have ever started to rise to industrial power if she hadn't been pushed by Mao? Under the nationalists, there was an urge toward industrialization. They had their plans. Sun Yat-sen in 1919, at the time of the Versailles Conference, put forward a plan to the participants in the conference, who were rich men, that the rich nations should supply China with $20 billion worth of aid. He didn't get it. So China had to go forward on the basis of self-reliance, but had started. If Mao hadn't started it, any other Chinese who would have been in control would have been bent toward industrialization. Whether there would have been progress at the same rate, one doesn't know. It might have been progress, however, at even a greater rate, supposing China had maintained the collaboration of the Soviet Union and been prepared for a gradual, normal advance instead of trying the great leap. What specific changes in U.S. policy would you recommend, would I first recommend, or two, regard as likely to occur in the near future? I presume this is with respect to China and not Vietnam, so I'll attend to China. What I would recommend is, as I implied in one of my first observations, that we cease looking upon China as inevitably the enemy. We look upon it as a country that has its needs, has its weaknesses. Look upon it as a country with whom we might eventually be reconciled, particularly if a new generation comes into power. And the actuarial tables will take care of that, won't they? In that event, if these are professional men, if they are engineers, they're concerned with better relations with sources of materials, supplies, and so on, even wheat, let us say, they might be prepared to adopt a less hostile attitude toward us if we would adopt a less hostile attitude toward them. We have said that our containment doesn't mean isolation. If it doesn't mean isolation, why don't we lift the trade embargo, for instance? If it doesn't mean isolation, why don't we lift the restriction on the issuance of passports to Americans? Only certain categories can get it, you know. And the Chinese won't issue visas on that basis. If we don't want to isolate China, why do we keep them out of the community of nations? So you see, there are things that one could recommend. Regard as likely to occur in the near future, that's easy, nothing. Will you suggest one or two references dealing with the last part of my speech? The last part of my speech was so long that I'm afraid I'm not quite sure what this means. So I will ask the person to come up afterwards and specify a little more clearly. For centuries, the family has played a major role in China. Business and industries were more family-run than investor-run. Must the family's position be destroyed to build the industrial China of the future? The answer is no, of course not, because, you see, we have built an industrial nation without destroying the family. There have been some dents put in it, perhaps, with communications and all the rest. I won't say it's as perfect as it used to be, but maybe it never was fully perfect. The Soviet Union, likewise, maintains the family. It has a role to play. I'm inclined to think that the attack on the family of 1958, and there was such an attack, was one of Mao's aberrations, that the family position will persist in China alongside advancing industrialization. Some have said that one party or government dictatorship is more effective in promoting developments in underdeveloped countries than is democracy. What is the evidence for this, if there is any? The support for this argument is found in the circumstance that in these underdeveloped countries, you do not have a middle class that is saving capital for investment in the industrial enterprises that you need for industrialization. And these underdeveloped countries are bent toward industrialization. The chief capital saving or collecting device is then the government. It is the one that is the entrepreneur. And it is said, therefore, that the state must be the entrepreneur. We tend to find that heterodox. But the state in the United States is at the present time undertaking various things that private enterprise has found itself unable to do, whether it's building a supersonic airliner or going to the moon. And although the Chinese don't propose at this juncture to go to the moon, nor do the Indians, they have needs which are at least as acute. But what are the values of the Chinese man? I'm not quite sure that I get the full sense of that. The Chinese man, if you take him in the mass, has different values from his leaders. The leader, or the leaders, Mao Zedong and his colleagues, look toward the aggrandizement of the state. They look farther than the Chinese man in the street or in the fields. The values for the Chinese man at the present time are, as I hinted in my treatment, material. He wants more of the goods of life. The person who is the intellectual Chinese man wants more knowledge, more access to knowledge. The values of the Chinese man, then, if you put him in the raw, are not always so far from our own. Does the emulation of Mao's thought, Mao's Red Book, etc., signal any departure in China's communism from Western influences as those of Marx? Yes, I believe that they do. This was suggested in Mao's own statement. Russian history created the Russian system. Chinese history will create the Chinese system. And he has said more specifically that doctrine must be fitted to circumstances, that Marxism must be fitted to China. And he has said, and Liu Shaoqi has said, and others have said, that Marxism-Leninism has been sinicized. That means that it has been changed from Marxism to something that is acceptable to Mao Zedong and his fellow theorists as a doctrine for China. It does have its differences. Given the fact that a new order had to emerge in China, do you think that it was inevitable that the communists would be the victors? No, of course. Disraeli once said, inevitability is not the language of politics. And China is a land of politics. Had the nationalists attended to the needs of the peasants, had they carried forward the programs that they had written on their law books, had they been more restrained when they returned to the part of the country made rich by Japanese entrepreneurship after World War II, instead of indulging in carpetbagging, they might have remained in power until the present time. But they gave China a bad rule, and in accordance with the old doctrine of Mencius, they were consequently overthrown as bad rulers. Why does Mao refute his own ideals just to gain industrialism? I think that Mao's attempted great leap, if the reference is to that, was in violation perhaps of some of his doctrine, but hardly of his ideals. He was a man in a hurry. You've had people in a hurry in Chinese positions of power before, through the centuries, and generally they have lost. I don't think that their attempt to gain industrialization is a refutation. It would be a fulfillment of his ideals. Where he has gone against his doctrine is in the actual implementation of the ideal, the way that he tried to get to his objectives. This is a part of his ideal as I see it. What is the future of Liu Shaoqi? That is speculative. Liu Shaoqi, of course, has been under attack by the Maoists since the summer of 1967, as I recall, rather specifically, and by implication even before that. Liu Shaoqi has refused to make an abject confession. He has refused to bend his neck to Mao's will. He retains his individual position as a Chinese leader. He retains his chairmanship, head of the Chinese state. He is not toppled over yet. He has, however, been in large measure discredited in the eyes at least of the Maoists. Whether he will be able to retain his position, whether he'll be able to remain alive, is uncertain. It is conceivable to me that he might even become the chairman of the Central Committee in succession to Mao Zedong, but I think it a little bit unlikely. I should be inclined to say, however, that even if his future is uncertain, the future of the professional, of the organization man in China, is fairly assured, more assured than the future of Mao. What do you see as the intellectual roots of the so-called new organization man? The intellectual roots, I think, would be discovered largely in Soviet thinking. They have thoughts with respect to new methods of economic organization, new incentives that they might build in, new efforts at decentralization so that you have a democratization of the economy. They haven't worked these out entirely yet. These would be the intellectual roots. The actual urges would be to achieve a strengthening of the Chinese economy, and it would be for those reasons that they would turn to such things. The further question is, how is this element of a different mind than Mao's? The difference resides in the circumstance that this is pragmatic. They would propose to be practical about the matter of economic development. Mao, as I think I suggested, is the dreamer. He is the revolutionary enthusiast. He is the utopian. Consequently, he would be inclined time and again to lead China into economic ventures which would prove, as that of 1958, disastrous. How strong is the pull of regionalism, for instance, in Xinjiang? Regionalism has always been strong in China. If the implication of the question is, however, how close are we to a return to warlordism, I would answer, not very close. I think that these people are all devoted to the idea of a unified communist China. You would get a chance of regionalism in the event that Mao tried to make the army go too far, when it would split into two parts, one pro-Maoist, one anti-Maoist. Then you would have different elements of the army cleaving out different regions for themselves, all of them being communist, as under the nationalist regime you had different nationalists reigning in different parts of the country. Xinjiang, mentioned here, is the closest to regionalism because Mao almost pushed too far there in the course of the great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. The ruler there, Wang Mao, proposed that the revolutionaries keep out, go home, stay home. They tried to press, and evidently he threatened military action. When Mao threatened military action in return, he pointed up the circumstance that China's nuclear establishment is in Xinjiang. And evidently he threatened that in the event that he were pushed too far, he would take control of that. He wasn't pushed too far. He's in power there still. But I think that if Mao retreats far enough, Wang and Mao will remain in power and remain in good relations with Peking under another control. You have the main regionalism on the part of Formosa at the present time. Is it possible to define the relationship between Mao and the government in North Vietnam and the organization Men in China with North Vietnam? The latter part of the question is very difficult to answer, so I'll just drop that. As regards the relationship between Mao and the government in North Vietnam, or Peking and the government in North Vietnam, I would point up two things. One, Ho Chi Minh is a senior to Mao Zedong. Mao may be able to point to Khrushchev or to Kosygin or to Tito and say, look, these are children, they're juniors, I'm the old man. But he can't do that to Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a communist before Mao Zedong was a communist, and he's older in years, he's older in the revolutionary movement. Mao also is Chinese, and Ho Chi Minh is a Vietnamese. The Vietnamese were for 2,000 years under the Chinese Empire, for 1,000 years a part of it, integral part, for another 1,000 years a vassal. It never made the Vietnamese love the Chinese. They don't love them now. They don't want the Chinese there if they can help it. If we force the North Vietnamese far enough, they'll call on the Chinese for help, but not otherwise. So Ho Chi Minh proposes effectively to maintain neutrality between Mao Zedong and Moscow. He wants only so much from Mao, only so much from Moscow, and he's taking more from Moscow. The relationship then is one where Ho Chi Minh desires to maintain his independence and will if he can. Could you repeat the groups in the Triple Alliance again? That's relatively easy. You have the revolutionary masses, the revolutionary cadres, that brings in the party, and then the People's Liberation Army. Does China have imperialist ambitions in Southeast Asia? Imperialist ambitions. The question is, what is imperialism? Imperialism is the effort to impose your will upon another country against the will of its government. China has ambitions in Southeast Asia, yes. It would like to restore its influence there. It would like to restore its influence over those parts of Asia that were once considered to be a part of the Chinese Empire merely because they were in vassal suzerain relationship to Peking. I think that that is true. There would be no effort to restore the vassal establishment because vassalism or vassalage is out of date. But you can have client states like we have, or you can have satellite states like the Soviet Union has. And the same sort of thing, isn't it? However, China's imperialist ambitions must be measured against its power and against the means that it would intend to use. China does not have the power to march across its frontiers and impose its will upon Asia against the rest of Asia, against the rest of Asia's will. Assuming the rest of Asia to be able to call upon the United Nations, the Soviet Union, the United States particularly. China likewise, in my opinion, does not intend to send armies across its frontiers. So you have certain ambitions which are limited by a limited power and limited likewise by the procedure that they would intend to use. So the imperialist ambition is nothing that we should be fearful of. At the present time, as regards this, you can properly regard China as a paper dragon. It has been said that one great accomplishment of the Chinese leaders since 1949 has been to give the Chinese people a new sense of making history, of achieving a great destiny. Do you agree, and in what sense may this be true? I think that that is true. At the time of the Korean War, despite the circumstance that the nationalist faction was theoretically on our side and only waiting for a chance to leap at communist China's throat, the nationalists on Formosa took a certain satisfaction in seeing the military accomplishments of the Chinese in Korea, just Chinese in Korea, against the United Nations, which were the Americans primarily. All Chinese feel a sense of pride when their country tends to make destiny. As a matter of fact, be it remarked that they are not alone in that regard. It is for us more the factor of pride that prevents solution of the Vietnam problem, probably, than certain other factors. How did Russia react toward the great proletarian cultural revolution? I happened to be in Russia at the time. Not all that time, but I went there in the fall of 1966 and spent a couple of months there. They viewed this as an aberration of Mao Zedong. They viewed it as an attack upon the Communist Party hierarchy. And they said that for that reason it was extraordinarily dangerous, that is, looking at it from the standpoint of their standpoint. Not dangerous to them as a threat to their nation, but a danger to China's communism. They viewed it, however, I believe, and I'll tell you why I believe that, as a passing phase. They thought that Mao would lose power. I say this because they attacked Mao personally. As the Chinese communists, beginning in about 1963, I think it was, began to attack Khrushchev personally as leader. So they now attacked Mao personally and laid the blame for the great proletarian cultural revolution on him. This indicates to me that they thought Mao was the passing phase, and that the opposition would probably come into power. It may be that they'll turn out to be right. What is the role of religion in communist China today? For instance, Confucianism. It's a minor role. In theory, there is freedom of religion in China. Whether it's Confucianism or Christianity, Islam or Islamic Buddhism. I beg your pardon. Lamaistic Buddhism, that is the type that you have in Mongolia and Tibet. You note that I left out Taoism. Taoism is the old religion of the individual man, of the Chinese who rejected organization, of the Chinese who was opposed to the bureaucracy, to the machine. That was the refuge for the person when he wanted to save his soul as an individual. So Taoism has come under strong attack in China, just as secret societies have. The others exist, but they exist weakened because the facilities are not offered. Christianity, for instance, has no contacts with the outside world. It is supposed to subsist by itself. Perhaps that's the way it should be, but in any event, that was a weakening factor. There has been an attack on Islam when Islam can be connected with Turkey nationalism, things like that. So in the overall, despite the lip service given to freedom of religion, religion is less free than it used to be in China. What general guidelines do you recommend for U.S.-China policy? I think I indicated that, adoption of the idea of that reconciliation might be possible, that perhaps we can coexist on this one fragile vehicle, the globe, that is plummeting through space without blowing it up. It would seem a logical choice in any event. What view does our, that is, U.S. administration, have of these latest developments in China? That is, are our present policies realistic? I think that the administration, I can't speak from the inside here, I don't know much more about it perhaps than you do, but I think that the administration has tended to adopt the position of Formosa in this regard, as we adopt their position in so many regards about China. The position of Formosa is essentially that any attempt to interfere in the course of events would tend to consolidate the regime rather than shatter it further. I think that that estimate is probably correct. There is nothing that would unify the Chinese more than an attempted landing on the mainland by Chiang Kai-shek, even if he were not backed up by the United States. These policies then, I think, are probably realistic. It's better, I think, this time just to sit on the sidelines rather than to get in there and cheer. Is Mao Zedong at all concerned with extending China's influence beyond her borders? Or is the great proletarian cultural revolution limited to China's internal problem? If I had stopped with the first question, I would already have answered it, but it's connected with the great proletarian cultural revolution. And this leads me to a point that is rather interesting. In the fall of 1966, at Peking, there was announced the circumstance that there was being organized a Red Guard International. All peoples might join this Red Guard International. All they had to do was to accept the leadership of Mao Zedong and acknowledge the preeminence of his thought and work for world revolution. Well, there were not enough recruits for the thing ever to get off the ground, and so they did back away from this. But you can see this initial urge to carry on with the great proletarian cultural revolution beyond China's frontiers, in line with the Maoist concept of uninterrupted revolution at home and abroad. Would you discount entirely an opinion from a well-placed observer in Hong Kong that Mao is dead? No, I wouldn't. I would remark the circumstance, however, that when I was reporting on communism in China in the 1930s,